She only has $2,000 to her name. My sister said it like a cheap punchline dropped into the center of our Christmas table, her voice bright enough to slice through every conversation at once. The room stilled. Forks paused mid-air. A few heads turned toward me with the same rehearsed sympathy people give to fallen ornaments. Madison stood beside the tree, the lights blinking behind her like a stage she believed she owned, her smile already curling, as if my life were a story she was allowed to narrate. She raised her glass slightly as if she expected applause for the announcement. My parents laughed first, that familiar, quick laugh that always arrived when the joke was on me. My mother pressed a hand to her chest as if she were embarrassed on my behalf while enjoying every second. My father shook his head and muttered something about responsibility. An aunt let out a tiny sigh, the kind that sounds compassionate but tastes like pity. Across the table, I saw a cousin lean in to whisper something behind a napkin. Nothing I had not heard before. People never whispered to protect you. They whispered to confirm the version of you they already believed. And still, I sat there, silent, hands folded in my lap, my fingers tightening around the corner of the napkin until it wrinkled. I kept my breathing steady because reacting would only feed the feeling that they expected me to swallow whatever humiliation came next. Jordan sat beside Madison. He was her husband, a CEO from a big fund in Columbus, a man everyone in the family treated like he was glass and gold. He did not laugh. His eyebrows pulled together for half a second, as if he had heard the line before, but did not quite accept it now. That was the first moment something in the air shifted, a small one, but real. One of my uncles spoke up with a soft chuckle. Some people just never get their life together. The table hummed with agreement. It always hummed like that whenever the conversation circled back to me. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that the more silent I was, the more they believed their assumptions were facts. Madison leaned forward with a bright grin. "Should we show them?" My stomach tightened as soon as she reached into her purse. In one quick motion, she pulled out a small, folded slip of paper and held it in front of her like a winning card. She flicked it open dramatically and read the balance out loud. $2,041.87. Then she added with a sweet, poisoned voice, "See, I told you." A few relatives gasped. Someone at the far end snickered quietly. My mother looked at me like she wanted to pat my hand but did not want to smudge her manicure. She said softly that she hoped I would learn to be more stable. My father took a sip of his drink and said he was not surprised. Not everyone was built for success. The humiliation landed in my chest with a slow, cold heaviness. Not the loud kind, the crushing kind. I kept my eyes lowered just a second longer because if I looked up too soon, they would think it hurt me more than it did. When I finally lifted my head, my gaze went straight to Madison. She was proud of herself. She always was. A lifetime of being the bright one, the chosen one, the girl who got everything first because somehow she made our parents feel like they had succeeded. I was the girl they forgot unless they needed someone to compare her to. My name is Ava Lane. I am 28 years old. I work as a data analyst in AI finance. And despite what the slip of paper in her hand suggested nothing about my life, was small, except the version of it my family chose to believe. Jordan looked at me again longer this time. Not pity, more curiosity, recognition even. The way someone looks at a file they know they have seen before but cannot place yet. His gaze flicked to my wrist, where my old watch sat. To them it looked vintage and cheap. To anyone in his world, it was a rare, limited edition piece only collectors would recognize. My laptop buzzed inside my bag, a soft vibration against the floor. I knew the subject line without looking. Q4 acquisition closing. The email I had been waiting for. The one I had no intention of opening in front of Madison. Her eyes darted toward the sound, but I casually nudged the bag with my foot until the buzzing stopped. She smiled smugly like she believed even my laptop was trying to embarrass me. Let it. There were bigger reveals coming. I just was not ready to hand them to her. Not like this, not on her terms. And then something unexpected happened. Jordan leaned forward slightly, just enough for the crystal on his glass to catch the white dining room lights. He tapped the rim once, a soft, clear sound that sliced through the murmurs the way a conductor signals an orchestra to hush. Everyone turned to him. He did not smile. He glanced at Madison, then at the slip of paper in her hand, then finally at me. Actually, he said, his voice calm and level, "There is something your family should know." When Jordan said there was something my family should know, I felt the old familiar tightening in my chest, the same tightening that had followed me through most of my childhood in Cincinnati, where every slight, every comparison, every dismissal had slowly taught me that being quiet was safer than being seen. And as I sat there at that Christmas table, surrounded by the noise of relatives who believed they knew everything about me, I could feel the years folding back on themselves, pulling me straight into the memories that had shaped the silence I carried. Growing up in our house meant existing in the long shadow of my sister Madison, who seemed to shine simply by walking into a room, while I learned early that attention was something granted to her, like inheritance rights, not something earned, and certainly not something shared. She was the kind of child adults adored naturally, photogenic, naturally charming, naturally loud, in all the ways families reward, and I was the child who slipped into spaces unnoticed, who drew quietly in corners, who never learned how to impress because the rules of impressing had been written without me in mind. I remember standing in the kitchen at 8 years old holding a small drawing I had worked on for hours, a little winter town in pencil with tiny windows glowing from the inside, and I showed it to my mother, hoping she might see something worth praising, but she barely glanced at it before turning her attention back to Madison, who was spinning in a sparkly dress bought for a school recital, and my mother clapped and said, "Look at her." She was made for the spotlight while I stood there with my drawing cooling in my hands like an object no one had asked for. My mother said often sometimes, as advice sometimes, as criticism sometimes, as prophecy, that computers would never give me a real future. And she said it in that tone that made her wrong feel right and made me feel small for believing in my quiet fascination with screens, keyboards, and lines of code. And she would say things like, "Why waste your time taking things apart in the garage when you could be learning something people actually care about?" And I would nod, because arguing never changed the trajectory in our house. It only lengthened lectures that always ended with "Be more like your sister." My father pushed that sentiment even further, insisting that Madison deserved the better choices, the newer clothes, the brighter opportunities, because she represented the Lane family well, while I represented the part of the family that was expected to compromise. And he said it as if it were simple math, as if I should understand that success was finite, and Madison had already taken the portion that mattered. When we were teens, the favoritism intensified in ways that shaped entire paths of our lives. And one memory, in particular, carved a permanent line inside me the day my parents opened a college fund for Madison with a full ceremony of pride, the kind where my mother brought out lemonade and my father explained compound interest as if it were an honor to end up in the family ledger, while I stood to the side asking quietly if I would have a fund too. And my father said, "Of course, sweetheart, yours is already handled," which I believed until years later, when the truth surfaced in the most painful way. I discovered my fund had existed once, but not for long, because Madison had taken it quietly and my parents had let her, and when I asked about it, they looked at each other with that shared expression that meant they had decided the story before I entered the room, and my mother said gently that the fund must be a misunderstanding because no such account was ever opened for me. And I felt something in me sink, a slow sinking that tasted like confusion and betrayal and indignity, all braided together because I knew the account was real, and I knew someone had spent it, and my father told me not to accuse my sister of things I did not understand. Meanwhile, Madison received a car on her 16th birthday, a shiny blue sedan with a bow, while I received a lecture about building character through walking and taking buses and learning humility because, according to my father, easy things made weak people. and somehow those rules applied only to me. I walked to school through rain and icy winter sidewalks while Madison arrived warm and dry, and my parents praised her punctuality, which stung in ways I never admitted, because punctuality is easy when privilege drives you to the front door. Even then, I found my own corners of refuge in the city library or the school computer lab, where I sat for hours after class, learning coding languages because the machines listened differently from people. They responded to logic, not favoritism, and in the hum of hard drives spinning and keyboards clicking. I felt seen in a way I rarely felt at home. And though I did not have words for it back then, something in me knew that understanding these machines would be the closest thing to freedom I could build for myself. I was 13 when I first felt that spark of quiet genius, though of course I never called it that. But I remember solving a problem on an old desktop computer that even one of the teachers struggled with, and he looked at me with the kind of surprised respect I never saw on my parents' faces, and for a moment I felt possible and real, which is more powerful than praise. It is a beginning. Yet every time I brought home achievements, certificates, invitations to summer programs, my parents would wave them off, saying things like, "Those are hobbies, not futures," or "You should stay realistic and help around the house more." And Madison would smirk the same smirk she used at Christmas when she held up my bank balance like a trophy she had earned, and I felt again how easy it was for her to take space and how impossible it felt for me to claim any. My childhood was a long, slow training in invisibility, and that invisibility shaped me, shaped how I walked into rooms, how I lowered my voice, how I carried my confidence like something fragile that could be dropped if handled too loudly. And as I sat at that Christmas table watching Madison bask in her performance, I realized I had spent most of my life letting them write the story of who I was, and they had written it carelessly with assumptions and labels and limits that were never mine, but became mine because I let silence hold them in place. What they did not know, what they had never cared to ask, was that the girl sitting at their table with the wrinkled napkin and the $2,000 balance slip was not the same girl they had shaped years ago in Cincinnati, and the seed of injustice they planted back then had grown into something else, something sharp, something steady, something ready to break through the script they kept handing me. And in that moment, as Jordan looked at me with recognition, I felt the first shift, the small, quiet certainty that the story was finally turning and not in the direction they expected. Leaving Cincinnati for Ohio State University in 2018 felt like stepping out of a dim hallway into a space filled with air and light. Not perfect light, but certainly brighter than the narrow beams that had followed me through childhood. And as soon as I arrived on campus with my single suitcase and my stack of secondhand notebooks, I felt a quiet stirring inside me, something like possibility, something like the first inhale after years of holding my breath without realizing it. And I remember how strange it felt to walk through crowds of students who did not know my family, did not know. Madison did not know the silent rules I had grown up obeying, and for the first time I sensed that I might be allowed to build a version of myself untouched by their expectations. I received a scholarship for data science, a fact my parents brushed off as luck rather than merit, which meant I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover everything else. One at the library, shelving books late into the evening, and another cleaning classrooms before sunrise. And although my days blurred into long stretches of study work and exhaustion, I did not resent it because it was the first time in my life where the effort I put in actually shaped my future rather than someone else's comfort. During those early semesters, I found my rhythm in a way I never had back home, moving between lecture halls and the quiet corners of the campus tech lab, where lines of code finally felt like a language that belonged to me. And as my confidence grew, so did the opportunities around me. It was during one of my late-night study sessions that I overheard two graduate students discussing a small AI startup called Finsight Labs, a scrappy group working out of a rented office above a bike shop in Columbus, trying to develop predictive financial models that could help mid-sized businesses understand market risks. And since data science was quickly becoming the only place I felt fully awake, I asked if they needed help. And within a week, I found myself joining meetings, even though I was the youngest in the room. Finsight Labs was messy and chaotic and brilliant in ways that made me feel like I had stumbled into a world that finally recognized the sharpness I had been hiding for years. And I threw myself into the work because it made sense, and because it felt steady, and because no one there compared me to a sister who could do nothing wrong. I remember spending nights debugging messy code with the founder, a soft-spoken man named Aaron, who seemed to understand the language of algorithms better than the language of people. And one night after a particular project crashed hours before a client presentation, he sat beside me in the glow of our screens as we rewrote entire sections of the model until sunrise. And when the client later praised the accuracy of our predictions, Erin simply pointed to me and said she saved this project. It was the first time someone had ever credited me so directly, and I felt something inside me rearrange slightly like a puzzle piece, finding its true position. Around that time, our extended family gathered for a spring barbecue, and although I rarely attended those events, I showed up because I still believed that maybe if I succeeded enough, my parents would look at me differently. But instead, as soon as I walked into the yard, I heard Madison laughing loudly as she told my aunts that I had dropped out of school because I could not handle the pressure, and I froze for a moment because it struck me how effortlessly she could twist my life into something small while I was out there building something real. When an aunt approached me with that same sympathetic sigh I had heard since childhood and asked what I planned to do now that school did not work out for me, I realized Madison had delivered her version of the story so convincingly that the truth no longer mattered in that space, and I simply nodded and excused myself. Instead of arguing, I returned to campus and buried myself in the startup work more fiercely than before, using the bitterness of being misunderstood as fuel to sharpen my skills further. Finsight Labs kept growing slowly, unpredictably, but always forward, and during one particularly risky quarter, our main predictive model started producing erratic results, threatening to sink our biggest client relationship, and I spent an entire weekend inside the office rewriting the core logic, correcting for overlooked variables, and optimizing the machine learning structure until the system stabilized. And when Aaron returned, Monday morning, he stared at the output graphs with disbelief, then turned to me with an intensity that startled me and said, "You saved us." And then after a quiet moment, he added that he wanted to give me 5% of the company, not as a gift, but as recognition, as partnership, as ownership. I was 19 the first time someone handed me something because I had earned it without being compared to anyone else. And for a moment, I could not trust it because it felt too foreign and too generous. But it was real, and it was mine. And it was the first thread in the web of power I was quietly weaving for my future. My parents never heard about the equity because sharing victories with them often turned into lectures about priorities and responsibilities, and envy disguised as advice, so I kept it to myself, a habit I learned early and perfected over time. By 2020, my coursework accelerated into graduate-level material, and I was invited to participate in a research initiative that later caught the attention of a Boston-based tech firm, and they extended an offer for me to join them as a senior engineer, an opportunity most students my age would leap into. But that was also the year my mother fell ill and needed someone to drive her to appointments and handle household tasks that no one else volunteered to manage. And when I mentioned the offer at dinner, my father barely looked up before saying that family comes first, and Madison quickly added that I was not ready for a job like that anyway. And in the silence that followed, I realized how easily they carved out my choices before I could claim them. I declined the offer quietly, returning instead to my studies and my part-time work and my secret equity. And although a part of me ached at the lost opportunity, another part recognized that not taking the job in Boston kept me closer to Finsight Labs and closer to the seeds of success that would one day grow far beyond what my family ever imagined for me. Through those years, I moved carefully but steadily, gaining skill after skill, project after project, until I could see the shape of a future that did not rely on their approval or validation. And with each late-night coding session, with each solved problem, with each recognition from people who saw me, for my mind, I felt the invisible boundaries my family had placed around me begin to loosen inch by inch, until one day they would break entirely. By the time I graduated in 2022 with my degree in data science and stepped into my first full-time role as a senior analyst, I felt a quiet pride growing inside me, a steady kind of pride that did not demand applause or recognition, and I carried it with me when I moved into my small apartment in Columbus and walked into the glass building where my team worked on financial modeling for a large analytics firm. And for the first time in my life, I was paid what I was worth, earning a salary with 6 figures attached to it, even though no one in my family knew, and I kept it that way, because sharing good news with them had never been safe ground. And I had learned too well that accomplishments became invitations for criticism rather than celebration. So I chose silence again, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally learning to preserve the parts of me they had spent years trying to diminish. Yet despite living hours away, the dynamic at home did not loosen its grip on me. And every phone call, every visit, every holiday somehow circled back to the same pattern of diminishment, as if my success were invisible to them, and Madison continued to be their shining star while I remained the child who needed guidance correction and unsolicited advice. And I remember sitting at Thanksgiving that year while my mother lectured me on the importance of finding a real career. And she said it slowly, as if she were explaining something delicate to a child, and I stared at her for a moment, wondering how many years of my life had been shaped around the belief that their version of truth was the only one allowed to exist, while Madison chimed in with her effortless cruelty, saying things like, "Data is not even a real job these days, companies fire analysts all the time." And while I forced myself to maintain the polite smile, they expected I could feel the old ache return, the ache of never being enough, no matter what I built or became. The first real blow, however, arrived in the most unexpected and humiliating way during a quiet afternoon at the office when my manager asked if I had a moment to step into a private room with HR, and the sudden seriousness in her tone sent a flicker of unease down my spine because I had not broken any rules. I had met every deadline and exceeded several performance targets. Yet the moment I sat down across from the HR representative and saw the concerned expression on her face, I knew something had been planted beneath my feet, something that did not come from me. And she slid her laptop around gently before showing me a long email, written in an overly emotional tone, claiming to be from a worried sister. And the message said that I was struggling mentally, that I had been unstable since childhood, that the pressure of work triggered emotional breakdowns, and that she just wanted the company to support me before something went wrong. And as I stared at the screen, I felt a single cold thought cut. Through the disbelief, Madison wrote this. The HR representative spoke softly, asking if I needed resources or support or time off, and I nodded mechanically until the meeting ended, keeping my hands steady even as something inside me trembled with both humiliation and anger. Not the explosive kind, but the deep, slow, burning kind that comes from being betrayed by someone who should never have had access to that part of my life. And when I returned to my desk, I pulled up the email header and confirmed the sender address. One Madison used in high school, one she still used for personal things, and there it was proof of how far she was willing to go, to make my life smaller, to make my achievements seem fragile, to plant the idea that I was unstable. Even though she had been the source of instability for years, and though the truth sat in my hands bright and undeniable, I closed the tab quietly, because confronting her would not fix what she had already set in motion. And because I had learned that telling the truth to people committed to misunderstanding you rarely leads anywhere except deeper into their narrative. Instead, I worked harder than ever showing up early, leaving late refining models, building dashboards, guiding junior analysts. And while Madison tried to paint me as fragile, I was becoming the opposite, resilient, strong, precise. And I poured myself into projects that earned recognition from the executive team, even as my family continued to assume I was drifting through life without ambition or direction. And every time my phone buzzed with a family group message filled with Madison's curated achievements, I reminded myself that my worth did not depend on their ability or inability to see it. In early 2023, after a year of disciplined saving and a deepening understanding of market trends, I quietly bought a small piece of land outside Pittsburgh, a neglected lot priced far below its potential, located near an area projected for redevelopment, and I purchased it under a separate holding account, with money I alone had earned. And it felt symbolic in a way I could not fully articulate, as if I were laying the first physical brick of a life built entirely from my own effort, untouched by their interference or approval. And no one in my family knew because I had grown into someone who understood the value of privacy, the protection in silence, and the strength in building quietly. At work, my contributions increased and my knowledge expanded with every complex data set, and I became the person people came to when a pattern did not make sense or when a model behaved unpredictably, and I thrived in the environment because unlike the home I grew up in, this place rewarded competence and consistency, and while my parents continued to ask when I would get a real career, I was becoming indispensable in mine. Still, the sting of the HR email lingered, especially when I returned home for birthdays or gatherings and overheard Madison telling relatives things like, "Ava is overwhelmed, poor thing, she almost quit her job." But of course she would never say it directly, because she preferred to shape narratives with soft tones and concerned expressions, the kind people believe more easily than the truth. And I smiled politely each time, letting her think she was winning, because I had learned that sometimes the best way to undo a web of lies is to let the liar weave it tighter until it collapses under its own weight. Through 2022 and 2023, I continued carving the path that would one day become the foundation for everything that followed. And though I faced humiliation, manipulation, and quiet cruelty from people who should have been my support, I kept moving forward each step, gathering momentum, until I could feel the shift inside me. A shift that told me the version of myself they tried to shape was dissolving, and a stronger version was taking its place. One they would never be able to control again. And as I worked through late evenings analyzing financial models and saving for investments, I did not know yet how these years would set the stage for the unraveling that would come later. But I sensed it quietly, the way you sense a storm before you see the clouds forming on the horizon. By the time 2023 unfolded and the weight of the HR incident finally dulled into the background of my long workdays, I felt as if life were stabilizing in small, careful increments. Yet whenever things seemed to fall into a rhythm, the past had a way of creeping back through cracks I did not notice at first, and it began quietly with something as simple as a strange envelope arriving at my apartment one snowy afternoon. The kind of envelope that looks too official to be ignored. And when I opened it, I saw a bill for a service I had never subscribed to, connected to an address that belonged to my family home in Cincinnati. And at first I assumed it was a clerical mistake, until 2 more letters arrived, followed by a notice warning that unpaid fees were affecting my credit, and I felt a slow, cold recognition settle in my stomach, because I knew exactly who in that house had used my name, my address, my information as if it were a resource that belonged to them simply because they never believed I owned anything on my own. I drove home that weekend trying to approach the situation calmly, thinking maybe there was confusion, maybe something needed updating, but when I stepped into the kitchen and set the stack of letters on the table, my mother barely looked up from slicing vegetables and said, "Oh yes, the company needed an address, and since you always ignore your mail, we just used yours." And when I pointed out that these unpaid balances were impacting my credit score, she shrugged and said, "It should not matter if I had nothing to hide," and my father added with a forced laugh that Madison simply forgot to pay, and that I should not be dramatic because these things resolve themselves eventually. And I stared at them for a long moment, realizing how casually they had made a decision that could take years to undo, while expecting me to absorb the consequences quietly the same way I had absorbed everything else they ever pushed onto me. I returned to Columbus feeling bruised in a way I could not fully articulate, carrying those bills in my bag, as if they were physical evidence of the lifelong pattern I kept trying to outrun. And for weeks, I called the company, negotiating, correcting, disputing, until the account was removed from my credit record, and for a moment I thought the storm might pass until a second betrayal arrived with far more force and far less ambiguity. I had applied for a rewards credit card that required a high score, and when the denial email came through, I froze not because the card itself mattered, but because the reason did, and buried in the report was a delinquent credit account opened 4 years earlier under my name, tied to Madison's spending habits, and the debt was significant enough to pull my score down like an anchor. And my first instinct was disbelief, followed by the slow, painful certainty that someone close to me had done this intentionally, and since Madison had always been careless with money, I assumed she had stolen my information. But the truth was worse. The signature on the account was not hers. It was my mother's, written in her soft looping style, unmistakable, with my name penned beneath it. And the realization hit me with a weight I could feel in my bones. My own mother had signed my name to open a credit line for Madison without telling me, and she had allowed the debt to grow silently in the background while I worked 2 jobs in college and built my life from scraps of opportunity, believing no one was helping me, when in reality they had placed obstacles in front of me with a smile. I sat alone at my dining table staring at the digital statement, feeling a mix of shame, anger, and a grief so deep it left me motionless for several minutes, because this was not an innocent misunderstanding. This was a violation, the kind that shapes a person's sense of safety for years. And I realized in that moment that if I did not start protecting myself, nothing in my life would belong to me, not even my name. So I began to collect everything. Every email, every receipt, every letter, every questionable document. I scanned them, I saved them, I labeled them carefully, because instinct told me that truth was my only shield, and I needed a map of wrongs before I could dismantle them, and I started storing files in encrypted folders, not because I wanted revenge yet, but because I knew that when the day arrived where I would need proof, I would have it ready. Through the bitterness that surrounded those months, I kept building my life quietly and strategically, and one opportunity appeared during a small investment fair where Aaron, the founder of Finsight Labs, introduced me to a friend of his who was raising funds for a new startup focusing on asset tracking for mid-sized banks. And the company was small, not well known yet, but the fundamentals were promising, and the projections even more so. And something inside me recognized the early spark. The same spark Finsight had years earlier, and after careful study, I decided to buy a 3% private equity stake, using savings I had accumulated from my salary and performance bonuses. I purchased it quietly through an advisor I trusted because secrecy had become a form of self-preservation. And I felt a strange, warm steadiness after signing the documents, as if I was stitching another invisible thread into a network of future independence and power that no one could touch. Meanwhile, my family continued their pattern of assuming I had nothing going for me. And each time I visited, I found my mother telling relatives how worried she was about my future, claiming I worked inconsistent hours, or that my company was unstable, or that I had trouble managing responsibilities, while Madison nodded sympathetically, and I remained silent. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that dismantling their narrative required patience, not confrontation, and I was quietly gathering everything I needed to do it. As winter turned to spring, I became someone sharper, keener, wiser, learning to notice small shifts in tone, small changes in financial statements, small footprints left behind by people trying to manipulate outcomes. And those months became a crucible, reshaping not just my understanding of my family, but my relationship with myself, and I no longer saw silence as surrender, but as strategy, holding my words like arrows waiting for the moment to release them. And through each betrayal, I felt a clarity rising within me, telling me that the life they believed I had was collapsing, while the life I was actually building was taking form in ways they could never imagine. By early 2024, everything in my life felt like it was being stretched too thin, as if every responsibility, every expectation, and every wound from the past had decided to collapse onto me all at once. And February unfolded with a heaviness that pressed into my chest day after day, because work had become relentless, with deadlines tightening and new projects stacking on top of each other, while I was also driving home, constantly to care for my mother, whose health had started declining in ways none of us fully understood, even though my father and Madison kept insisting she was fine and that I was exaggerating as usual. And the weight of being the only one who actually showed up was beginning to wear me down in ways I could feel, even in my bones. I found myself working late into the night, staring at code until my eyes blurred, then waking before dawn to answer messages from my manager, who trusted me with more than anyone else. And I should have felt proud, but all I felt was exhaustion. And then, after long work hours, I would get into my car and drive 2 hours to Cincinnati to check on my mother, whose medications were always misplaced or mismanaged. And every time I tried to ask my father to monitor her more closely, he would give me the same dismissive line that Madison and he had everything under control usually said, while Madison scrolled through her phone, showing off pictures of luxury brunches or weekend trips, bragging about how stress-free her life was and how people like her deserved beautiful things because they worked hard. And I would stand there listening to her talk about spa memberships and shopping hauls, while I was silently calculating how to cover extra medical expenses my parents conveniently forgot to mention, and she would glance at me with that familiar smirk and say something like, "Poor kid always looks tired. Maybe you should try enjoying life instead of chasing pennies." And she said it in front of relatives, in front of neighbors, in front of anyone who gave her an audience, and each time I felt a mix of humiliation and something darker, something like despair curling inside my chest, because no matter how much progress I made, no matter how much I built, they still saw the same version of me. They always wanted to believe in the one who would never climb high enough to challenge the pedestal they had placed Madison on. The breaking point did not come in an explosion. It came quietly arriving through my inbox on a rainy morning in March, when I opened my email and saw dozens of messages, responses, and forwarded threads from relatives asking if I was all right and pleading with me to stop asking them for money because they could not help me. And at first I thought someone had hacked my account, but as I read more, I realized the messages were not from me, yet they had come from my email address, and the words were unmistakably crafted to sound like I was struggling financially, asking for small loans, begging for temporary help, promising to repay soon, the kind of tone that makes someone appear desperate and unstable. And when I scrolled to the bottom of one chain, my breath caught because I recognized the phrasing. It was almost identical to the way Madison used to text people when she wanted something urgently, and I knew instantly that she had accessed my email likely through some old shared device from years ago, and used it to send messages to relatives, painting me as needy, irresponsible, and poor. And for a moment, my entire body went cold, because this was no longer petty sibling rivalry. This was defamation using my identity to manipulate the family narrative, and the shame hit me so hard I had to sit down because even though I had done nothing wrong, seeing my name attached to those messages made me feel like I was losing control over the story of my own life, and anger rose then fell, then twisted into something numb, a hollowing out that made everything feel distant, like I was walking underwater, moving slowly, trying to outrun a life I no longer recognized. I confronted Madison over the phone, my voice shaking not with fear but with exhaustion, asking her why she would do something so cruel, and she laughed a thin, sharp laugh and said, "If you do not want people to think you are broke, maybe stop looking like someone who has nothing." And something in me collapsed at that moment, not physically, but emotionally, like a pillar snapping after carrying too much weight for too long. And for the first time in my life, I felt the urge to disappear, not dramatically, not impulsively, but quietly. Simply stepping back from this entire family, removing myself from their orbit so that they could no longer reach me, no longer drain me, no longer rewrite my identity without permission. For weeks, I stopped answering messages, stopped visiting home unless absolutely necessary, and even then I spoke little and moved through the house like a shadow, observing the chaos, watching my father misplace bills, watching Madison parade around with her designer bags, watching my mother grow sicker, while no one except me seemed alarmed, and each visit felt like walking into a room filled with smoke where I knew I could not breathe much longer. But even in that darkness, there was a faint pulse of something else, something like a distant shift, something that whispered change was coming, even if I did not yet know in what form. And that whisper arrived in April when I received a confidential email from Aaron, the founder of Finsight Labs, requesting a private call the next afternoon. And I remember sitting in my apartment that night, staring at my laptop, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in months, because he never reached out unless something significant was happening. And during that call, he told me that a major financial firm was entering final negotiations to acquire Finsight, and that early projections suggested a buyout much larger than expected. And hearing that news felt like someone had opened a window in a suffocating room, letting in the first breath of air I had tasted in months. And though nothing was finalized yet, the possibility alone was enough to keep me steady enough to move forward. Through February to June, I lived in a strange dual world, one where my family was dragging my name through mud, chipping away at my sense of worth, and another where my professional life was preparing to catapult me into a financial position none of them could even imagine. And I learned then that breaking points are not always the end. Sometimes they are the last quiet step before everything shifts. And while I sat there watching my mother sleep on a warm June night, listening to Madison laugh in the living room like nothing she did mattered, I whispered to myself that this was the final season of letting them break me, because something enormous was approaching, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. By the time October arrived, the air in Boston had begun to shift into that crisp cold that seems to sharpen every sound and every thought. And I remember stepping out of Logan Airport that morning with a heaviness still clinging to me from the months before, yet there was also an unfamiliar steadiness forming somewhere inside me, as if the fatigue and humiliation and betrayal had burned away just enough of my fear to make room for something else. And I could not have explained what that something was until my phone rang while I was walking toward the rideshare pickup lane, and I saw Aaron's name flash across the screen, and my heart gave a brief, startled jump, because he rarely called without scheduling first. When I answered, his voice carried a restrained excitement, and he asked if I could step somewhere quiet, and I ducked behind a column, listening as he told me that the acquisition was finalized. Maybe not soon, not almost, but finalized. And there was a long moment where I felt absolutely nothing, as if my mind had paused to confirm the words, and then the meaning hit me, like a sudden rush of warm air, and I sat down on my suitcase because my legs would not steady. He explained the numbers, slowly making sure I heard each detail, the valuation higher than projected, the distribution equitable, the vesting schedule expedited. And then he said my portion after taxes was $790,000. And hearing that amount felt surreal. Not because the number itself startled me, but because of the contrast between this quiet win and the noise of everything I had endured in Cincinnati. and for a moment, all I could think of was Madison waving around her designer bags, calling me poor kid, while I carried the weight of a future she never imagined existed. I thanked Aaron quietly because celebration never came easily to me, and he chuckled, telling me I had been the backbone of their predictive systems, and that the buyout would not have happened without my model. And before hanging up, he added one more thing, which became the twist that shifted everything he said. The acquiring firm wanted me to consider an advisor role, a flexible consulting seat with influence in product direction and forecasting meeting access to high-level meetings and future investment rounds, meaning a voice that mattered. And that kind of offer was not flashy but powerful in the way doors open quietly for people who have proven themselves. And I remember feeling something unfamiliar, a kind of validation that did not inflate my ego, but instead restored a part of me that had been eroded by years of being dismissed. I flew back to Pittsburgh the same evening, and when I entered my apartment, nothing about it had changed. The same small living room, the same modest decor. Yet I felt like I was standing in a different life, because for the first time I could breathe without calculating what I could and could not afford. I could see the horizon of my future, not as a fragile hope, but as a structure I could finally build. I moved efficiently, sending the buyout funds into a private investment account, labeling nothing in a way my family could ever trace. And the quiet of that decision felt empowering, because success that stays invisible is the kind of power no one can weaponize against you. Within a week, I began scouting property listings around Pittsburgh, looking at undervalued duplexes and small single-family homes in neighborhoods undergoing early redevelopment. And because I understood the data patterns well enough, I could see opportunities others missed, and I secured 2 more properties through clean cash offers, raising my total assets to nearly $1.2 million. Though no one around me, except a single closing attorney, had any idea who I had become financially. At night, I would sit in my small kitchen sipping tea while scrolling through the digital folders I had begun assembling, tracking every financial betrayal my family had placed in my lap, every falsified signature, every expired debt linked to my name, every mocking message Madison had sent about my so-called failures, and I saved them carefully, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, because revenge done right is simply the truth, arranged in the right order, and I knew that someday soon these details would matter. I printed physical copies of the buyout contract and stored them in a fireproof lockbox along with the deed to my first Pittsburgh property and the drafts of my advisor contract, because if I had learned anything from my sister, it was that paper trails protect you far better than words ever can. As the days passed, the heaviness that had lived inside me for years slowly transformed into a quiet determination, a realization that everything my family mocked me for was the very thing that had carried me into a life they would neither expect nor understand. Sometimes I would imagine my mother sitting in her recliner, unaware that her youngest daughter was now building a foundation more stable than anything the Lane family had ever managed to create. Sometimes I imagine Madison bragging at brunch about her husband's income, while having no idea that the sister she called poor kid had surpassed her by simply not needing to broadcast a single accomplishment. And those visions did not make me smug. They made me grounded, because I knew how quickly a person could lose themselves to the need for approval, and I had spent my entire childhood learning to survive without it. One late night in October, I sat at my desk looking at 2 screens, one showing the official transaction confirmation from the acquisition, and the other displaying a spreadsheet I had been constructing, documenting every instance of financial exploitation my family had dragged me into. And as I stared at the 2 realities side by side, I felt everything inside me settle into a decision, not one born of anger, but of clarity. I would no longer allow them to define me. I would no longer let them shape the narrative of who I was or what I had earned. And if they attempted to humiliate me again, I would not retaliate with cruelty. I would retaliate with truth, backed by documents and timelines and signatures and financial proof that they could not twist or deny. That was the night I realized the revenge I had been building was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was quiet, methodical, and inevitable. And the buyout was not the climax, it was only the setup, the shift in power that would put me in the exact position I needed to be standing steady and silent when Christmas came. And Madison prepared her next performance unaware that this time I would not be the girl, sitting small at the end of the table. I would be the storm she never saw coming, disguised in small kindnesses and polite smiles, with a truth sharp enough to cut through every lie she had ever wrapped herself in. And as the clock passed midnight, I closed my laptop gently, because the future had finally tipped in my direction. And all that remained was waiting for the moment it would unfold in front of those who thought they knew me best. December arrived with a thin layer of frost settling over Pittsburgh each morning, and I often found myself standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee, watching the breath of winter roll across the river, while my mind drifted between the life I was quietly building and the echoes of the one I had tried so long to escape. And for a few peaceful days, it almost felt possible to exist in that quiet world without thinking about my family. But calm never lingers long in a story like mine. And on the 7th of December at 8:23 in the morning, my phone chimed with a message from Madison, so short and so casually venomous that I knew instantly she was setting up something she wrote. Christmas dinner is at 6, don't be late, and the phrasing was simple enough, yet the tone slipped through the cracks like a thin blade, because Madison never invited me without a hidden intention, and she certainly never used the word dinner unless she was planning an audience to witness something cruel. And I stared at the message feeling a pull in my stomach, not fear exactly, but the familiar warning that always came before Madison decided to perform some new act of superiority. And I typed back, okay, because silence was often more powerful than pushing back. And she responded with a single heart emoji, which somehow felt more threatening than any insult she could have written openly. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on work and meetings with the acquisition firm, because the advisor offer was progressing smoothly, and each conversation reminded me that I had stepped into a world my family would never comprehend yet. Despite the forward momentum, I could not shake the tension building in my chest whenever I imagined walking through my parents' front door and sitting at that long dining table while Madison held court and spun whatever narrative she had prepared for me, and I promised myself that I would not walk into that house unprotected, not again, not after everything they had taken from me and every lie they had woven about me. On December 10th, I drove to Cincinnati to check on my mother because her health had continued its slow decline, and I needed to see her with my own eyes before the holiday dinner. And when I arrived, she was sitting in her recliner watching a cooking show, her face pale yet warm as she smiled at me. And though she tried to act strong, her hands trembled slightly when she reached for mine, and I squeezed them gently, whispering that I was there now. But as we talked, I noticed the house was strangely busy with voices slipping through the hallway, and I realized Madison was in the kitchen, speaking in a low, hurried tone that sharpened as I stepped closer. And though I had no intention of listening at first, something in her voice made me pause by the half-open door, and her words drifted through as clearly as if she had said them to my face. She said, "Just wait until everyone sees Ava's pathetic finances. She actually thinks she is doing well, but her account balance looks like a high schooler's allowance." And my mother murmured something weakly, something like, "Madison, maybe you should not." And Madison cut her off saying, "No, they need to see the truth. It is about time. People stop acting like she is something special." And in that moment, something inside me went very still, not broken, not shaken, simply still like a lake surface before a storm. And I stepped back quietly, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation, but layered this time with a calm certainty. Because unlike all the years before this time, I was not walking blind into her cruelty. This time, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what she did not know about me. I left the hallway before she could see me returning to the living room with my expression steady, and my mother looked at me with an uneasy softness, as if she wondered how much I had heard, yet lacked the courage to ask, and I kissed her forehead gently, telling her I would see her soon and that everything would be all right. And though she nodded, I knew she sensed the shift, not anger, but resolve settling over me like a cloak. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the lockbox that held the documents detailing my real financial life. The buyout contract, the advisor agreement draft, the deeds to my Pittsburgh properties, the investment statements, the confirmation emails, the cap table where my name sat clearly among founders and investors, and I laid them out on the table, not because I intended to flaunt them, but because I needed to choose which pieces of truth would speak loudest if Madison pushed me to the edge again, and I selected only a few, the most precise, the most irrefutable documents that required no explanation, and whose numbers alone would silence any performance she tried to stage. And I slid them into a discreet folder, one that fit easily into my bag, not a weapon, but a mirror ready to be held up whenever Madison tried to twist the narrative again. In the days that followed, I moved through my routines deliberately, keeping my voice even and my heart steady because anticipation can be its own kind of pressure. But every time I reread the message Madison had sent, I felt a strange calm rise in me, understanding now that I would not be walking into that house as the girl they thought they could humiliate freely, but as the woman who had built something quietly unstoppable. And on the night before Christmas Eve, I sat in my living room, the only light coming from the small tree in the corner, and I whispered to myself that this would be the final year I allowed them access to the parts of me they tried so hard to break, because once a lie is exposed publicly, it loses its power forever. On Christmas morning, I packed my bag, carefully slipping the folder into the inner pocket, then taking a deep breath as I locked my door behind me. Feeling the cold air brush against my face, as if reminding me that clarity often arrives in winter, and as I drove toward Cincinnati, the familiar roads felt different, not suffocating, but purposeful. And I realized that for the first time, I was not going to my parents' house out of obligation or guilt, but out of choice, because this time I would not sit silently while Madison orchestrated her spectacle this time. If she turned that dining room into a stage, I would let the truth speak for itself, steady, undeniable, and unembarrassed. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, the house glowed with warm lights and distant laughter filtered through the walls. But the sound no longer had the power to shrink me, and I stepped out of the car adjusting my coat, gripping the bag lightly, and telling myself one quiet promise that whatever happened when those doors opened, I would remain calm, I would remain factual, and I would not let their shadows reach into the life I had fought so hard to build. And as I walked toward the porch, I could already sense the shift that was coming, not explosive, but precise, the kind of shift that makes the air itself hold its breath, waiting for the moment the truth finally steps into the light. The moment I stepped through the front door, the warmth inside felt strangely artificial, like the heat from a display fireplace, and I could hear the clatter of forks and the polished laughter that always grew louder when Madison had an audience. And as I hung my coat by the entryway, I caught a glimpse of her standing near the dining table, arranging her expression the way an actress rehearses before stepping into a scene. And when she saw me, she widened her smile just a little too much, the kind of smile that meant she was already imagining the moment she would strike. And I walked into the room, calmly greeting relatives who looked at me with that mixture of condescension and curiosity, as if checking whether I still fit the role they had written for me long ago, the role of the quiet one, the one who never had much, the one who never pushed back, and the table was set beautifully with gold-trimmed plates and glittering glasses, while the Christmas tree glowed behind Madison like a spotlight. And Jordan sat beside her, his posture composed, although his eyes followed me with a sharpness I recognized from our last encounter, when something in him began to shift, though he said nothing then and said nothing now, at least not yet. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the seat always reserved for the least important person, and I settled into it without protest, because this time I wanted to see everything clearly. And as the food was passed around and conversations swelled and the house filled with warm scents, I could sense Madison waiting for the perfect moment, the way she always waited, letting anticipation work in her favor. And when the laughter reached its peak, she tapped her glass lightly and rose to her feet, all eyes turning toward her as if she were delivering a toast, and she placed one hand on Jordan's shoulder as though marking her territory, then looked down the length of the table toward me with the sweetness of someone about to reveal a surprise that was anything but kind. She said, "Since everyone is sharing updates tonight, I think it is time we talk about someone who has been hiding something." And I felt the air tighten as relatives glanced at one another, leaning forward slightly. Because Madison knew how to orchestrate attention, and she continued with a practiced sigh. Ava only has $2,000 to her name, and her voice rang out with a clarity designed to humiliate me in one strike, and some cousins gasped while others smirked, and I heard a quiet, "Oh dear," from an aunt who always liked to play the part of concerned bystander, and Madison let the moment stretch before adding, "She is a failure. She has no real job. She will never own a home. She will never have a future." And she said it lightly, almost playfully, as if she were presenting a funny anecdote at a party, while my mother lowered her gaze, pretending not to notice the cruelty, and my father nodded subtly, as if approving the message behind the words. Then Madison reached into her purse, pulling out a folded slip of paper, and she held it between two fingers, lifting it delicately for everyone to see before unfolding it with theatrical slowness. And she said, "I can prove it. I checked." And she held up the printed bank balance, $2,041.87, and the number sat there under the harsh dining room lights as though it were a punchline, and everyone burst into laughter, except for Jordan, who stayed perfectly still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly while Madison laughed, the loudest pressing one hand to her chest, like she had said something clever and necessary. And I sat there, hands resting on my lap, breathing steadily, feeling none of the humiliation she had intended to inflict, because I knew something she did not know, something she never imagined. The room was still echoing with laughter when Jordan finally stood, pushing his chair back slowly, and the sound of wood scraping against the hardwood floor cut through the noise with a clarity so sharp it silenced even the boldest voices. And he set his napkin down calmly, then looked at Madison with an expression that made the laughter choke off entirely. And he said, "Actually," and his voice carried a weight that made every head turn. "Ava Lane is the reason our fund acquired FinSight Labs," and a hush fell over the table, so complete it felt like the whole house exhaled at once, and Madison blinked her smile, faltering for the first time as Jordan continued speaking with a tone colder and calmer than I had ever heard from him, explaining that my work, my models, my projections were the backbone of the acquisition, the reason the deal closed, and that my contribution was not small, not accidental, but foundational. And then he reached for his tablet, which he had placed beside his plate earlier, and, with a swift motion, connected it to the living room television mounted on the opposite wall, and the screen lit up with a soft blue glow cutting through the warm holiday lights. The first file appeared metadata clearly showing my name embedded within the project files, then access logs showing timestamps and contributions and charts that tracked the progression of the model, and the room grew colder as slide after slide revealed work that could not be questioned, and Madison's expression changed from confusion to panic as she stepped backward slightly. Her breath catching each time another graph or document revealed just how deeply she had misjudged the person she had tried so hard to belittle, and the table remained silent, except for the soft sound of the slides changing as Jordan continued the presentation, showing cap tables with my equity stake marked, plainly showing financial projections tied to the acquisition, and behind the numbers lay a truth that needed no defense. And when Jordan finished, he placed the tablet down, slowly letting the silence settle, before looking around the table and saying with absolute certainty, Ava is not the failure here. No one spoke for several seconds, not even my father, who usually had a remark prepared for any uncomfortable moment, and my mother stared at her plate, unable to lift her eyes, and I simply looked at Madison, who stood frozen beside the tree hands, trembling ever so slightly as she struggled to process the collapse of the narrative she had spent years building. And I said nothing, because silence was stronger than any speech I could have delivered. And in that quiet, I realized that the balance in the room had shifted entirely, that the humiliation she had tried to cast over me had recoiled and settled over her instead. And it was the first time in my life where the truth stood beside me without needing to fight for space, and the first time I saw Madison as someone crumbling under the weight of her own lies, rather than towering over me with the confidence of someone who believed she could never be challenged. And as the television screen dimmed, the room felt hollow, exposed, stripped bare of all the illusions my family had clung to, and I knew that nothing would ever return to the way it was before this night. For several long seconds after the last slide faded from the television, the room felt like it had been drained of air, as if every person sitting at that table had forgotten how to breathe, and I could feel the weight of their shock pressing in from all directions. Yet none of it touched me, because inside I felt strangely calm, almost steady, the way a person feels when a long-held truth finally rises to the surface and refuses to be pushed back under. And I watched Madison try to shape her mouth around some response, but no sound came out, only the faint tremble of someone realizing the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. And then my mother finally spoke, her voice tight and wavering as she said, "Ava, how could you hide money from your own family?" And I turned toward her slowly, feeling the absurdity of her accusation settle into me, because after everything they had taken, everything they had erased, she still believed she was entitled to anything that belonged to me and my father. Joined in almost reflexively, saying, "We could have helped you invest it properly if you had trusted us." And I felt a cold clarity rise inside me, knowing that this was the narrative they would always choose, the narrative where I was ungrateful, secretive, selfish, instead of simply independent. Then Madison found her voice latching onto the only angle that could make her seem like the victim, and she said loudly, "Ava stole opportunities from me. She ruined my chances. She has been competing with me behind my back," and the desperation in her tone cracked through the silence like brittle glass, because even she could hear the lie, but she hoped someone, anyone, would cling to it and give her a lifeline. And as I looked around the table at the faces twisting between confusion, denial, and dawning recognition, I realized that this was the moment I had been walking toward for years, the moment when silence would no longer protect me, but would protect them, and I was done offering protection. So I stood up slowly, not dramatically, not with raised voice or shaking hands, but with a steady intention that felt heavier than the room itself. And I reached into my bag, retrieving the folder I had prepared days before the folder I had packed, because I knew Madison would try something. I knew she could not resist performing cruelty when she believed she had an audience, and I set the folder gently on the table, letting it rest in the center like a quiet verdict. Then I opened it with a single motion, revealing neatly stacked documents, each one placed deliberately and with purpose. I slid the first page forward, a printed email chain addressed to my HR department, written from an account with Madison's name but disguised as a concerned sister, claiming I was unstable and needed monitoring. And I watched my father's eyebrows pull together as he tried to process what he was seeing, and I did not give them time to speak before sliding the next set of papers forward, documents from the credit card company showing the account Madison had opened 4 years earlier under my name with my mother signing in my place. And I heard my aunt gasp quietly while my mother pressed her fingers to her temple, as if a headache had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Then I added the scanned record of the college fund that had been drained when I was 17, signed off by my father with a note saying the money was rerouted to urgent family needs, which I later learned meant Madison's dance trip to Miami. And my father leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing not with guilt but with the slow realization that there was no version of the story where he could reshape himself into the hero. Finally, I placed the last set of pages on top, a series of printed messages Madison had sent to relatives, calling me a financial burden, a dropout, a failure messages. She never expected anyone to see, especially not tonight, and when those pages settled on the table, the room fell into a silence so deep it almost hummed, and I felt all the years of being dismissed and underestimated gather themselves into a single sentence, rising into my throat with a quiet strength I had never felt before. And I said, "You did not want my success. You wanted my silence." The words were not loud, but they landed with the weight of something undeniable, and no one dared to respond. Not my mother, who looked small for the first time, not my father, who stared at the documents like they were written in a language he could no longer decipher, not Madison, who had gone pale as if she were trying to calculate how quickly everything she depended on had begun to dissolve. I reached for my coat draped over the chair behind me, slipping one arm through the sleeve, then the other, moving with the kind of calm that comes only when the last piece of fear drains away. And I looked at the people who had shaped my childhood, my adolescence, and my early adulthood into a series of quiet battles no one saw, and I felt no obligation to comfort them, no obligation to soften my exit. And I said softly, "You wanted me small because it made you feel big, but I am done living inside the version of me you created." And I turned away from the table, ignoring the calls of "Wait, Ava." And can we talk about this? And this is not the time. And I walked toward the front door with steady steps, hearing the muffled chaos erupt behind me as Madison tried to defend herself to Jordan, who no longer looked at her with affection, but with a kind of distant recognition, as if he had finally connected every red flag he had ignored. I placed my hand on the doorknob, pausing just long enough to take one final breath in, that house filled with memories that had taught me more about survival than love. And then I opened the door, letting the cold December air rush in, filling my lungs with a sharpness that felt purifying, almost like beginning again. And without looking back, I stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind me with a quiet click that sounded nothing like defeat and everything like freedom. The cold air outside steadied me as I walked down the driveway, yet even from a distance, I could still feel the chaos rippling through the house behind me, voices rising and overlapping as if the collapse of the narrative they had clung to for years had cracked open, something none of them knew how to contain, and I kept walking without turning back, because the moment I closed that door, I understood that whatever happened inside was no longer mine to carry. It was theirs, to face theirs, to untangle theirs, to answer for. And the silence I stepped into felt cleaner than anything I had felt in years. In the days that followed, the fallout spread through my family like a slow-moving storm, not loud at first, but steady and undeniable. And the first ripple came when my aunt called me, asking softly if I was all right, while stumbling over her words, because she did not know how to acknowledge that she had laughed at Madison's cruelty before understanding the truth. And she mentioned that Madison had been unusually quiet in the family group chat, barely responding to anyone. And when she did, her messages were clipped and defensive, as though she were trying to outrun the humiliation that had lodged itself firmly in her shadow. Soon after, I heard from a cousin that relatives were distancing themselves from her, not dramatically but noticeably, pulling back from her invitations, ignoring her attempts to redirect the story, blaming everyone except herself, and the cousins who used to adore her polished photos and curated bragging began referring to her with an uncomfortable tone as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time and disliked what they saw, which was not the glamorous sister she portrayed, but someone who fed off belittling others, especially me. Meanwhile, my mother, who had always carried herself with rigid confidence, found herself cornered when one of my uncles called, asking why her signature appeared on a credit agreement attached to my name. And she tried to deny it at first, but the paperwork was too clear, the timestamp too precise, the handwriting too familiar, and as the questions continued, she eventually admitted that she had only meant to help Madison during a difficult period and that she never expected it to go this far. Yet no one accepted that explanation without judgment because for the first time, she could not hide behind the narrative of being the responsible parent, and the weight of that truth settled heavily on her reputation. I learned through another relative that my father had his own reckoning at work when his co-workers, who once admired him for raising 2 daughters with such contrasting paths, began whispering after someone pulled up the city court records, showing the old financial dispute connected to my drained college fund. And although nothing criminal appeared, the mere fact that my name was attached, while Madison benefited, made him look like a man who chose one child at the expense of another. And at the office Christmas party, he reportedly spent most of the evening alone nursing a drink and dodging uncomfortable glances because people who had long respected him were now questioning what kind of father he had been. As for Madison, her downfall was slower and sharper, and it began the morning Jordan confronted her at home, asking about the $15,000 missing from the charity budget he oversaw at his company funds intended for holiday outreach programs for families in need, but instead spent on spa packages, luxury appointments, and weekend getaways, all visible in her transaction history. And when he asked her to explain, she tried to deflect, saying she deserved something nice because life with him had become stressful, and that the charity money was practically unused anyway. Yet none of it convinced him, and he demanded she repay every dollar immediately before the internal audit reached final review. The scandal spread quickly because charitable funds are sacred, and when people discovered she had diverted the money for her own indulgence, the shame became public and irreversible, and I heard that she cried for hours, begging Jordan to delay the repayment demand, but he refused, telling her plainly that her choices had consequences and that her sense of entitlement was destroying everything around her. And that night she slept in the guest room while he reviewed documents in silence, refusing to comfort her the way he once did when she complained about minor inconveniences in her life. Throughout all of this, I remained silent, not distancing myself out of malice, but because I understood that involvement of any kind would drag me back into a story I had finally stepped out of. And every time someone called me asking for clarification or attempting to reshape the narrative, I said briefly that the documents speak for themselves, then ended the conversation, politely leaving no space for drama, because the truth did not require my commentary. It simply required time to settle into the minds of the people who had ignored it for so long. I focused on my work on the quiet rhythm of data and projections and meetings with the acquisition team, preparing for the advisor role I would soon take on. And each morning I checked my email, noticing that invitations to family events had stopped arriving, which did not hurt the way I once feared it might. Instead, it felt like a clearing, a gentle removal of noise that had long clouded my thoughts, and for the first time my days moved with a sense of self-direction rather than emotional survival. One afternoon in January, I sat at a small cafe reviewing a property inspection report when a message from my aunt arrived, a short text saying, "Your sister is not doing well," and I stared at the screen for a moment, recognizing the urge in her words, the expectation that I would rush to fix what had broken. Yet I felt no compulsion to save Madison from the consequences she had built with her own hands, and instead I put my phone face down on the table, letting the message sit unanswered, because not responding was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of boundary, something I had never been allowed to practice. Later that week, I heard that Madison tried to gather support from relatives, claiming the Christmas incident was blown out of proportion, but no one defended her because the evidence Jordan presented was irrefutable. and the documents I left on the table were impossible to reinterpret, and slowly she realized she was standing alone in the spotlight she had once loved, now burning her skin with a kind of scrutiny she could not charm her way out of. And as all of this unfolded quietly behind me, I went on living, because I finally understood the cost of staying in a family that celebrated my suffering and denied my victories, and I knew that remaining silent now did not mean surrender. It meant choosing myself over the story they wanted me to inhabit forever. By the time February arrived, the cold in Pittsburgh had settled into the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel sharper, and I found myself slipping easily into a routine that felt nothing like the life I used to know. Waking early to review advisor briefs for the acquisition team, then checking on the renovations for my newest property before settling into long analytical sessions that steadied my mind. And for the first time, there was no background noise of family demands or emotional debts waiting to be paid, only the quiet rhythm of a life I had carved out on my own terms. Yet even with that peace, I sensed something approaching long before it reached my door, because people like Madison never accept consequences without first searching for someone else to absorb the impact. It happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon when I returned from a meeting and saw her car parked crookedly near the curb, outside my building. The glossy paint streaked with salt from winter roads, and the sight of it made something inside me tighten. Not with fear, but with a weary recognition. And I walked toward the entrance quietly, hoping she would turn away before we met. But she did not move, and when she lifted her face, I saw the traces of sleepless nights smudged beneath her eyes, and the frantic shine of someone cornered by a situation she believed she did not deserve. She stepped toward me quickly, saying my name with a breathless urgency that told me she had rehearsed this moment, and I paused a few feet away, keeping a careful distance, while she forced a shaky smile, pretending for one strange moment that we were sisters who spoke kindly to each other, and she said, "Ava, I need to talk to you. It is important." So I unlocked the door and let her follow me into the lobby, because I wanted walls around this conversation, not for my protection, but for clarity. As soon as we reached the elevator, she burst into her explanation, speaking in rapid fragments about overdue notices and missed payments, and how the mortgage company had refused her extension, and how Jordan had separated their finances after the charity scandal, leaving her responsible for the entire $850,000 loan. And every word tumbled out like a confession she hoped would soften something in me. But I listened silently without offering the comfort she seemed to expect. When we reached my apartment, she hesitated at the doorway as if expecting warmth to pour out. Yet the quiet inside was cool and orderly and entirely mine, and she stepped in only when I nodded, looking around as though seeing a version of my life she never imagined existed. And perhaps it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands before finally saying it, the line she had been building toward with trembling breath. "Ava, you are rich now, help your own family." And she looked at me with a mix of entitlement and desperation, a blend only she could manage, because she truly believed that blood erased betrayal, and that my success was an extension of hers to claim whenever she pleased. I studied her for a long, quiet moment, feeling an ache somewhere deep but distant. The kind of ache that comes from recognizing someone you once wished would love you now only sees you as a financial solution, and her eyes searched mine for softness and found none, because whatever affection I used to hold for the idea of having a real sister had faded long ago, replaced by something colder but truer. She continued speaking faster, telling me she was months behind on payments. The bank was preparing foreclosure documents. She had nowhere else to go. Jordan would not bail her out, and our parents were dealing with their own reputational fallout. And she said, "If you help me just this once, I will pay you back. I swear I will change things between us." And her voice cracked slightly at the end, as if she wanted to sound sincere. But sincerity had never been something she valued unless it benefited her. I walked to my desk without answering and opened the drawer where I had placed a small folder days earlier, because something in me had known Madison would come eventually. The same way a storm comes, even when you try to convince yourself the sky will stay clear. And I picked up the folder, feeling its weight not heavy but definitive. And I returned to sit across from her, watching hope flicker in her expression as she reached out her hands, expecting money, expecting salvation, expecting the version of me she had relied on for years. Instead, I placed the folder gently on her lap and she looked down, confused, pulling the cover back to reveal not a check, not cash, not a transfer slip, but a printed packet of instructions for filing. Chapter 13, Bankruptcy in the State of Ohio, complete with highlighted sections for reorganizing debt timelines, for repayment structures and contact information, for legal assistance programs. And when she looked back up at me, her face was a map of disbelief and anger and fear, all tangled together, as if she could not comprehend that this was the only thing I intended to give her. I held her gaze steadily, letting the silence stretch until it was impossible for her to ignore. And finally, I spoke quietly, but with a firmness that left no room for misinterpretation. I said, "This is the only thing I owe you," and her breath caught in her throat, her lips parting slightly in shock, as if she had been slapped, not physically, but with reality. A reality she had avoided for years because she was so accustomed to escaping consequences through manipulation or pity or family obligation. She tried to protest, saying, "Ava, please, I cannot do this. You know what people will say?" And I nodded slowly, replying, "Yes, I know exactly what people will say because they have been saying it about me for most of my life, while you watched and laughed and added your own voice to theirs." And she flinched because she could not rewrite that truth, not now, not in front of me. She looked down at the papers again, her fingers trembling, and she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" And the question itself revealed how deeply she misunderstood me, because she believed that refusing to save her was punishment, when in reality, it was release from a role I never chose and never wanted. And I told her quietly, "You built this life. You built these debts. You built this version of yourself, and now you must carry the weight of it, because I will not do it for you anymore." She stared at me, her eyes shining with tears. She would never let fall, and after a long moment she stood clutching the folder as though it were a foreign object, then walked to the door without another word, leaving the apartment as quietly as she had entered her footsteps, fading down the hallway until there was nothing left but the gentle hum of the building and the clean, steady air of my own life settling back into place. The days after Madison left my apartment unfolded with a strange softness, like snowfall, that has no need to announce itself, and I found myself settling deeper into the quiet life I had built along the Allegheny, where the river moved with a slow, steady confidence, mirroring the way my own heart finally began to move, without the weight of old expectations pressing against it. And each morning I would step outside into the crisp Pittsburgh air, feeling the cold brush my cheeks as I walked along the waterfront path, watching the city stretch awake in small motions, the lights dimming in office towers, the first buses rattling past the bridges, humming faintly with early commuters, and for the first time in years, my mind did not race ahead to anxieties or backward to memories. It simply stayed still, matching the rhythm of my footsteps, as though my body was relearning how to exist without enduring something. My new apartment was modest, but filled with a peace that felt richer than anything I had grown up with. Sunlight sliding across my small living room in wide golden strokes during late mornings and quiet evenings spent reading financial briefs or sketching early models for projects the acquisition team wanted my insight on, and sometimes I would pause mid-task, feeling a sudden swell of gratitude, not dramatic but grounding, because I could finally feel the difference between surviving and living, and that difference changed the texture of every single day. News of my family's unraveling reached me slowly through half-hearted texts from distant relatives and stray bits of gossip from people who still tried to make sense of the Christmas disaster. And though I did not seek updates, they arrived anyway, painting a picture of a household collapsing under the pressure of its own long-ignored truth. My mother fielding questions about legal signatures she should not have provided. My father pretending he was not bothered by the whispers at work, even though he began leaving early. My sister scrambling to restructure debts she had created long before she realized there would be no version of me stepping in to save her. And through it all, I felt no triumph, only a recognition that consequence is not cruelty when it arrives as the natural end of choices repeatedly made. Even Jordan had pulled away from Madison more than she expected, and though we never spoke about it directly, I sensed from the few mentions I heard that he had reached a breaking point of his own understanding, that kindness without accountability becomes permission for someone to keep hurting themselves and everyone around them, and that realization seemed to shape the quiet distance he kept. In contrast, my days felt fuller, not because I was doing more, but because the space inside me was no longer occupied by the constant noise of trying to earn respect from people who had no intention of giving it. And as I walked the river path each morning, I could feel that empty space slowly filling with something warmer purpose, not tied to obligation ambition, not tied to proving myself peace, not tied to permission. And this internal shift made the world seem wider in ways I had not experienced since childhood, when possibility still felt like something I was allowed to touch. One morning, I stood by the railing looking out across the water as thin sheets of ice drifted between the reflections of the bridges, and my phone buzzed with an email notification, and I expected a work update or a property inspector confirming a schedule. But when I saw the sender, I paused Jordan Hale, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. Not out of resentment, but out of a desire to protect this quiet I had earned. Yet curiosity tugged at me gently, so I opened the message and read his words, slowly letting each line settle into me. He wrote, "You deserved better." And the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than any apology I had ever wanted from my own family, because it acknowledged the truth without decoration or excuse. He continued saying, "If you ever start your own company again, our fund wants to back you." And he added that he had always known I was talented, but did not understand until recently how much I had accomplished alone and how much strength I had carried without recognition. I reread the message twice, not because I needed clarity, but because something about it felt like a final stitch, closing a wound that had been left open for too many years. And I realized in that moment that validation from him did not fill a void. It simply reflected the truth I had already claimed, the truth that my worth had never depended on anyone's acknowledgement, not even his, and not my family's. Certainly not Madison's, and I closed the email gently storing it, not as a door to walk through immediately, but as a reminder that the world I had stepped into held opportunities untainted by old narratives. As I leaned on the railing watching the river shimmer beneath a pale winter sun, I whispered aloud, "Success does not need an audience." And the words drifted into the air with a feeling of release, as though I had finally spoken the truest thing about my life. And I smiled softly, not with triumph, but with understanding that this quiet, steady version of me was the most powerful form I had ever been, because it was built not from spite or competition, but from healing and autonomy and truth. I walked home slowly, breathing in the cold air, letting the morning settle around me with the gentle promise that the years ahead would not need to be defined by the chaos I grew up in, because I had stepped out of that story completely. And as I reached my building, I paused at the entrance, turning back toward the river, one last time, silently thanking the version of myself who kept going even when no one believed she would become anything, and the version who learned that letting go is not abandonment but arrival, Wherever this story finds you, I hope you hear the quiet strength inside your own life, the one that grows when you stop seeking permission to be whole, and I hope you allow yourself to walk toward whatever future answers back with steadiness and peace. Have you ever outgrown a toxic family? Share your story below.